Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in African American Studies, a channel on the New Books Network. My name is Adam McNeil, co-host of the channel. On today's episode, I'm interviewing the great Dr. Claudrena Harold, author of When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras, published in 2020 by the University of Illinois Press. This is a long one, but hey, when you have a topic like gospel music to chop it up about, you got to take your time. Enjoy, family. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Harold. How you doing today?
I'm great.
Good. Well, hey, I'm so glad that you're on the podcast here today because, When Sunday Comes has been a book that I've been, as I've said before with other people, the streets been waiting for this. The streets has been waiting for this. And so I'm super duper glad that you're here today to talk about this amazing book. And so, as I said in my subject heading, it is interview time in the sanctuary. Let's go and let's get into it. So, can you tell us about the Genesis story behind When Sunday Comes?
Sure. So, When Sunday Comes tells the story of gospel music's commercial growth and sonic evolution during the last 3 decades of the 20th century. It highlights, the brilliant innovations of some of gospel's biggest stars, the centrality of Black-controlled institutions in gospel's growth, and the complex and often contradictory political messages within Black sacred music. As a child, music was my sanctuary. And I developed a deep love for gospel music, due in no small part to the centrality that it had in my family. And so I would say the genesis of this book was my childhood. I always listened to gospel music. I religiously purchased the records of my favorite artists. I devoured Billboard magazine and a lot of the gospel magazines. And it was just a central component of my life. When I think about my time in Philadelphia, I recall the nights that I would spend with my teammates, where we would just listen to my temple teammates, where we would just listen to music. And we listened to all kinds of music. There was no sacred or secular divide, but invariably there would be, this moment where we would just, listen to gospel. And so we would play, Commission and the Winans and Take Six and, of course, Kirk Franklin, early Kirk Franklin.
Early.
And, he had just come out, really. And so it was always a part of me. But I got to grad school and I was working on Garveyism and Black nationalism. But I was always reading about popular music. And so I think around 2012, Asala started a magazine called Fire. Mm-hmm. And Daryl Scott asked me to write something, and I wrote on the Winans and the Clark sisters and Commission and sort of gospel out of Detroit. And it was so weird. Like, I can vividly remember being uncomfortable typing Jesus for the first time. Like, ooh, it's different.
Yep.
And so I think one of the things that you battle with, or at least I battled with, was gospel music was such a passion for me, and it was such a part of my interior life. I didn't know if I wanted to share that with the rest of the world. And so I think from 2012 until around 2015, 16, I was sort of making that decision. And then I made that decision. It's like, okay, I'm going to write a book about gospel and write about some of my favorite artists and some of my favorite albums and how the albums sparked intense debates about Blackness and politics and religiosity and all of that stuff. So the genesis of the work was definitely my childhood, but it bears the imprint of all the stages of my life.
Outstanding, outstanding. And so it's incredible because your book is a tour de force about about gospel music in the last really 50 to about 60 years. And so it was it was a learning experience for me. And also I can imagine you writing, when you say writing Jesus, seems like, oh wait, this is a little new here, right? Might have written in a journal, but like, for something that's more publicly consumed. But before we get too far into the interview here, to ground some of our listeners, because I know that not everyone is necessarily going to know this particular history, although we've largely had it in the background in certain ways as a lot of Black folks. But can you discuss the difference between contemporary Christian music and gospel music? And because I think that grounding our listeners in that particular difference will be really generative for the rest of our discussion here.
Yeah, so within Christian music, there has always been these denominational and racial divides. And when we say gospel music, most of us are thinking Mahalia Jackson, Thomas Dorsey, James Cleveland, the Clark sisters, so Kirk Franklin. So when we say gospel music, we are often thinking about a form of Christian music whose primary fan base and architects were African American, rooted in the blues, rooted in jazz, rooted in soul. Contemporary Christian music is a genre that really emerges in the 1960s and 1970s, and it is predominantly white. It is heavily influenced by rock as well as pop. Its main architects are people like Larry Norman and Keith Green and the great Andre Crouch.
Mm.
And so contemporary Christian music is really its own genre. It rose to popularity during the Jesus movement. Um, it had its own radio stations, its own magazines like Contemporary Christian Music, and it had also its own record label. So within that genre, there were labels that didn't have African American artists until the late 70s or the 1980s. And so when I say gospel music, I'm thinking about sort of a more Black African American art form. And when I say contemporary Christian music, I'm talking about a historically specific genre that emerges in the 1960s and 1970s and is predominantly white. That does not mean that there haven't been African Americans who didn't cross over into that genre. People like Andre Crouch, who is really a leading architect of that genre and the praise and worship style that comes out of that genre. But also people like Leon Patillo, Denise Williams was popular within that context. And also later people like BB and CC Winans and Take Six.
And so before we got on here, you discussed your enjoyment and your love for the process, as not as much, correction, you really enjoy the process as opposed to just simply like the product, right? To make sure I got your words there correctly. So can you discuss with us in terms of how the process of making When Sunday Comes? Can you discuss that a little more about how you did that, and also for something like this, as you know, as a Negro who does stuff for the 18th century, my people ain't alive, so oral history ain't exactly what I do. More of like a memory project, if anything. So, can you discuss any oral history interviews you might have conducted for the book as well?
Sure. Yeah, it's always interesting when you do history and the people are not alive, and the people are alive, and so they can talk back to you. And so that was even different for me moving from the Garvey movement to gospel. I wanted to tell the story of gospel music's commercial growth and sonic evolution. I wanted to tell the story of those major gospel records that people played on the radio or listened to on the radio, that folk performed in church. And and that also shifted the genre. And so one of the first decisions that I had to make was, who were some of the artists that I wanted to focus on. And so I knew I wanted to tell a collective biography, or make this a collective biography. So move from, say, James Cleveland and Andre Crouch and Shirley Caesar to Kirk Franklin and Yolanda Adams. At the same time, I wanted to have a historically grounded narrative that situated the music within a larger political um, and social context. I wanted to tell the story of how gospel music reflected some of the political tensions of the Black Power movement. It reflected some of the political tensions of the rise of the Christian right and the moral majority. And so I knew that I had to engage with newspapers, with major music publications. So I really immersed myself in that literature of the time. So reading every album review that I could, reading every newspaper article or Ebony and Jet magazine article, reading all the biographies that some of these artists had written. So quite a few, like Shirley Caesar and Kirk Franklin, had written biographies. Also going back to notes that I had from the 90s when I had encounters with some of these artists. And I won't name all of these artists, but I was a music head that always went to gospel concerts. And in 2016, I started going to the Gospel Music Workshop of America. And so people like Fred Hammond, Richard Smallwood, a lot of the founding members of the Gospel Music Workshop of America, they were there. And so I would go to different things and I would ask questions. And so the interviews were somewhat informal. I'm so glad that I took great notes in other capacities. But at the same time, I did not want to always rely on the recollections of the artist about a particular moment. Because one of the things that I discovered was that there were sometimes contradictions in memory. So I'll say it like this. If somebody came out with an album in 1978, and you listen to that album and you think it is groundbreaking, you think it's brilliant, but it didn't sell well, and I won't name the artist, but how that person talked about that album in 2016 or 2017 was not the same way that they talked about that album in 1978. So part of your job is to balance their memory, their recollections, their understandable frustration. So one of the things that we also should recognize is that when an album doesn't do well, when an artist has certain economic hardships associated with a certain period, they sometimes don't want to talk about that.
Yep.
And so part of my job, part of my responsibility was to have as diverse primary sources as possible and to rely on my own reading of those primary sources to do that. So I relied on interviews that I conducted, and I also interviewed fans, record owners, and gospel record store owners. It was very important for me to tell this holistic story of the music. And so I also relied on oral histories that were in archives. And so, for example, like at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, they have a Southern History oral collection. And in the 70s, they interviewed African Americans who had been tobacco workers and who worked at Leggett and Meyer. One of those tobacco workers was Hallie Caesar, the mother of Shirley Caesar.
Wow.
And there's audio of that, but there's also a 10-page, a 10-page transcript. And so I was very fortunate to also find just some amazing stuff in the archives. From the University of North Carolina to Indiana University. Indiana University has the most amazing music archive that there is when it comes to African Americans, particularly African American music. The work of Portia Malsby and Melanie Burnham is just amazing. So I spent some time there. And they also have gospel music magazines that you can't find anywhere else. Fortunately, I was a collector of gospel magazines, so I still had stuff from the 1980s that I collected as like a 10, 11, and 12-year-old. So,
Wow.
and a lot of VHS tapes, a lot
Good.
of video soul interviews. So, it was a mixed method. Yeah.
No, that's incredible, and I know that our listeners are very very interested to know how this all happened.
Mhm.
Because you laid down for the people, so we appreciate that. And so, can you also discuss too, going back into the process a little bit? I don't know if you know this, Dr. Harold, but you're one of the most prolific scholars in the game. I don't know if you know. I don't know. I think you might. But let me tell you, you are. So I know folks once again are going to be interested in hearing your answer to this question. So in terms of constructing When Sunday Comes, what did your writing process or practice consist of, and or since you know since our last book that you were here
Mhm.
to discuss, Charlottesville 2017, was there any change in your process in this time as well between your last edited volume and this single authored book?
Yeah, it's interesting. I could have I couldn't have written Charlottesville 2017 or probably survived the aftermath without gospel music.
Mm,
So, one of my most vivid memories was the first day of class in the fall semester of 2017. And I had been relatively calm for most of the time, but I never forget coming on campus, and I could hear the echoes of the white supremacists sort of in my head.
mm,
And it's the first day of class. I'm teaching labor history, and I know I have to hold it together for my students. And I remember reaching into my book bag and grabbing my iPod and listening to gospel music. And in that moment, only James Cleveland and Aretha Franklin would do.
mm,
And so the music had always been with me. And so actually, I was working on a gospel book while I was also trying to put together that volume. Um, and I never forget the first major event, which was sponsored by the history department. And I had to give a talk on African Americans at UVA in the post civil rights era. And I would never forget a first year student said, "How do Black people have faith?
mm.
How do Black people maintain faith?" Or to ask that James Cone question, what keeps Black people, why do Black people continue to pray when theologians say that prayer is useless?
Whew.
And gospel music helped me sort of navigate some of that. And so the writing process was about, first of all, making sure that I communicated the importance of this music and the deep meaning that this music holds for people. And to select a group of artists. And I know some folks not gonna like why you talked about this person and not that person.
Mm-hmm.
But to select a group of artists that I felt were central to the story and that the story that I wanted to tell couldn't be told without them. What I mean is, no Andre Crouch, probably the trajectory of Walter Hawkins' career in the 70s and the 80s is different. He facilitates him signing with Light Records and releasing Love Alive. No Walter Hawkins, know a lot of other stuff.
Yep.
No Andre Crouch. Maybe it takes a little longer for the Winans to get a record deal. No BB and CC Winans. Maybe Sparrow is not as willing to take chances on other artists. I mean, there are artists, no Kurt Franklin, things are different. So there are artists who have so much commercial success that they transform the possibilities for others. There are
Mm-hmm.
also artists who are so innovative in what they're doing, they transform the art form.
Yep.
No James Cleveland, I'm not talking to you right now.
There
We're
it
not
is.
talking about a gospel book. And so At the same time, I wanted to tell the story of artists who, okay, BB and CC, Kurt Franklin, these are the successes of crossover. Well, what about an artist who's also hugely successful, Vanessa Bell Armstrong, but has a different crossover story? So I wanted to use particular artists and particular groups to tell a larger story. I wanted to use Al Green to move away from just Al Green and the grits incident. And that's why he started singing gospel, and tell the story about how no, gospel provided him with a certain aesthetic space, a certain artistic space to embrace, I think, that Southern soul that he articulated in his other music, but as the industry was changing in the late 70s, it was a lot harder. So for me, the writing process was deciding who you were going to write about, which albums you were going to focus on. So that was very important to me. Like, I wanted to talk about gospel albums the same way people talked about Bob Dylan albums and Stevie Wonder albums. So I wanted to write like a music critic. I wanted to write from a perspective of a gospel fan who was and is often frustrated when I see greatest albums of all time and you never see gospel albums on there.
Yep.
And so I wanted to also take, and this may come from like just working in film now, I wanted to take the art seriously. So sometimes I would spend just a week writing on one song. Like Tremaine Hawkins' Going Up Yonder, or the Hawkins, I spent like 2 weeks just trying to write about that, and also just listening to her sing and trying to write it down. And it was difficult because I don't know music theory. And so I had a lot of insecurities about that, like not knowing certain technical aspects of music, but I wanted to describe the music. I wanted to describe what she was doing with her voice. I didn't want it to be just kind of this essentialist reading of, man, Black people can sing. It's just like, which is, I'm not going to say, I wanted to be descriptive. And so part of the writing process was just listening to things over and over again, going to the archives, thinking about what people said about those songs, figuring out who's playing on the song. So you can't talk about like the Hawkins and not talk about, Joel Smith and his bass work and his work as a drummer. So it was also about including a session, and then to also talk about the debates, to talk about the debates of how people responded to Kurt Franklin or the Winans, and to talk about the ways in which those debates had continuities and discontinuities, and how it revealed the way and what it revealed about not just religion, but also about race, questions around authenticity. And so that was really the process, doing the research, selecting the artists, going back and doing more research, the writing process, really trying to provide a background of the people, but also talking about the songs and taking the art seriously. Talking about songs that had great commercial success, but also talking about songs that are central to our worship experience, as say Christians, right? So songs that shape homegoing services. Songs that shape weddings, songs that if someone performs well, oh, she can sing.
And notice, folks, she didn't say sing, she said sang. Let that be known, right, listeners.
And that's important. That's what maintains the culture. It's not just about record buying. It's not just about just radio play, but it's also about the ways in which this music integrates and informs, Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, and you can see me, so I'm cheesing like a mug. This is just amazing, because to me, you're so right. Just thinking about, why do people not take the craft of gospel music as seriously as they take other genres of music? And so I didn't have this question in mind before, so give me some space here. So I'm interested to know, because when I think about the archive and how people collect data and collect, their archival. So can you actually discuss how you actually, what's the gathering process and the storage process? Because as someone who works on, like, a more paper archive. I'm actually very interested to know what does a sonic archive look like for you, and in terms of storage and stuff, because like I'm just you got my synapses going right now, Dr. Harold. I'm hyped right now.
Right. So probably for the past 25, I never go to a city without going to a record store.
Mm.
And that's largely because I'm a gospel fan. And unlike jazz, gospel doesn't get a lot of reissues that have, extended editions. We get what I call filling station. The filling station. That's how I used to say it as a kid. Filling station. CDs where you open up the CD and like there's no liner notes. It's just blank. And so I'm a record collector. And so because you got to get the liner notes.
Mm-hmm.
So the liner notes tell a deeper story. And when you're talking about the 60s and the 70s, usually a journalist wrote a story about the album and it's on the back. So part of my sonic archive, and I'm just a collector. Now, I've stolen a lot of stuff from family and friends who my mom reassured me, that's okay, you stole out of your auntie's basement because she stole it from me. So it's like, but I used to go over my aunt's house on the weekend when I was a kid, and I love to play basketball, and she didn't have basketball hoops. So the only thing was to do is to go in her basement, and I would just read liner notes. And so I was always a collector. So part of the archival process was collecting those records. And then I was a fanatic about how well my favorite artists were doing on the charts, like Houdini and Run DMC and Whitney Houston. And so I used to read Billboard magazine as a kid, but that was because my uncle was a writer and a producer for Atlantic Records, and that's what my mom did as a kid. She read Billboard and Cashbox to keep up with her brother. So she never looked at me as kind of weird for doing this. So I would go to the public library and I would just read magazines. And then I started buying them. And so I have some magazines that I've had since I was 12 years old.
Wow.
And some of them I've purchased on eBay. But that was the basis. So the archive for me is you're constantly building that record archive, and then going to Black bookstores and Black record stores that oftentimes, like Barkey's in Richmond that was opened in 1958, or Reed's in San Francisco. I've gone to all of these places. And they often have posters and promotions from 1975 and 85 still hanging on the wall. So part of the archival process was using actually Black record stores, the few that are remaining. And that's one of the most important things that we have to really address, is the fragility of the archive. But actually that was my archival center. Sometimes people would give you stuff. I would just buy stuff. So I have just all of this stuff. I collected. I went to Indiana. They have an amazing archive. But then sometimes it's just luck. It's like going through North Carolina. I still just doing searches, going through Floyd McKissick's papers with CORE and finding this entire archive with James Cleveland in his efforts to form a Black college in Soul City, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the most important archives was the Gospel Music Workshop of America. So that is an organization created by James Cleveland in 1967, and they meet every year. And they have a part of the convention, it's all about singing and performances, but they have an academic division where they actually talk about the history, but they have what they call the largest traveling gospel library. And they bring it out once a year. Wow. And they have all kinds of stuff. I mean, it fills an entire room. And it's like, come on, baby, just come through. And so they got to know me. They let you, if you want to copy or take pictures, you can't take anything. Mm-hmm. And so I would spend 2 or 3 days, just every convention, just learning. And so it's a living archive. It's the living archive that people maintain. And so that's what the archival. So I'm always like on the ground. So when I would go to Chicago, when I would go to Oakland, as soon as the plane hit the ground, like I'm putting on the sneakers and I'm just walking to Pilgrim Baptist Church because I want to know what it feels like walking to Walter Hawkins church, walking to Ephesians, where he recorded Love Alive 1, but also where Bobby Hutton's funeral was,
Mm-hmm.
and where his father-in-law, his grandfather-in-law, Reverend Cleveland, E. Cleveland, eulogized him. So I'm always trying to get the feel. If I hear Walter Hawkins talking about in order to make money performing at 3 different churches in Oakland, I like literally walked it. I wanted to know what that
Right.
experience was like. So it was like always, going to Durham, North Carolina, going to Shirley Caesar's childhood home, thinking about that song I Remember Mama, where she talks about getting happy in the backyard and trying to just sit in that space, stand in that space without the neighbors thinking I'm crazy, and just trying to like feel that. So I wanted to feel that. And for me, that was the joy. Like I'll once everything opens back up, I'll still probably go and do that kind of thing. Cause it was joy. Walking from her house to North Carolina Central, where she attended school her first year, just thinking about all of that, thinking about her, thinking like understanding that geographical landscape, going to dorm and going to Union Baptist where John P. Key went to church,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to understand when he said, I was born in Durham, North Carolina, outside the county line. I wanted to understand that. And so sitting in that space, um, that's for me, that's a part of the archival process.
Man, see, and I know my favorite cultural historians out there just salivating out there, just excited, waiting to get out, and to also use some of the same methods because I think that is very important. Let me see, I moderated a discussion for the latest AIHS conference where Dr. Thavolia Glimpse said she don't write about a place unless she's been there. And
Mm.
so, in large part through her work. And so like that, what you just said reminded me of what she just said a couple months ago in our discussion. And
Mm.
also,
That's true.
yeah, and that's something as someone who's doing a dissertation proposal, like on the 18th century Chesapeake, it's like, okay, I lived on the Eastern Shore for a summer, so I know what driving,
Hmm.
like I know what it's like. Obviously they didn't drive at the time, but like going over the Bay Bridge and kind of thinking about, okay, if I'm going over this, how did African American folk,
Hmm.
navigate routes to freedom? And so it's like being centered in the place and going to and the funny part what you just said was make sure the neighbors don't think I'm crazy. Because look, this is, it's an important
Yeah.
piece. It's an
Yeah,
important
and
piece.
place is so important because so much about this book is understanding the regional dynamics that shape the art forms development. So, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like we start with James Cleveland. And so we start in Chicago, and that sacred order of Chicago that Wallace Best talks about that shaped James Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
He's developing within a cultural matrix, an institutional matrix that includes um, Thomas Dorsey and Roberta Martin and Mahalia Jackson. But then we moved to California, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so California, LA, and San Francisco really shapes the art form. And then there's no talking about the art form without Detroit,
Right.
and the Clark sisters and Commission and that the Winans and that Detroit twang.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that also includes people that I don't talk about, like Thomas Whitfield. And then if you're thinking about the larger Michigan area, um, Rance Allen. But then, like we in Dallas, we in Texas, we in Dallas, Fort Worth with Kurt Franklin, and then even with Yolanda Adams in Houston. And so place is so important. So yeah, you have to be there and you have to understand how the rhythms of those places and all the other cultural forms in those places. You know, you can't talk about Detroit gospel without talking about the polish and the shine and the sonic perfection that was Motown, you know? And so, yeah, place is important, and you gotta, you know, yeah, you have to be there. Like, yeah, so you doing like you doing Virginia, you got to go to Virginia and get caught in one of those one of those thunderstorms. Like I got caught in one after seeing D'Angelo one time, and it was in Norfolk, and we got drenched, and but it made me understand so much about the 17th and 18th century, like that space, right? And so yeah, you gotta immerse yourself in that place.
Look, and we were all immersed into some D'Angelo a couple months ago with that verses. That and you know D'Angelo and Friends.
Right.
That was one of my favorites of them.
D'Angelo and D'Angelo.
Right. I think you know when we talk about the music from this last year and a half, you know, you got to say D Nice, you got to say verses, and you got to say, you know, Jill Scott and Erica Badu and Hammond and Franklin and
Yeah.
some of their missteps in there. You know, that was pretty egregious, but so when Sunday comes, as folks are going to notice, with your amazing book consists of 11 chapters and an epilogue, and not all the chapters are of similar length. So I'm actually really interested to hear what you say about this. So I don't usually ask my authors to comment on this aspect of book creation, but how did you actually decide on the organizational structure of When Sunday Comes? Because I know you had mentioned some of the folks who might have been left out on the cutting room floor, but can you discuss in terms of the actual organizational structure, right? When did you know that you were ready to press submit on that or on those
Yeah.
chapters?
I think when I didn't get pushback from the reviewers.
Okay.
I also think that I felt as if I would have tried to move chronologically, like a narrative, where you go from saying and the book really starts in 1968 with the Gospel Music Workshop of America and ends with Kirk's emergence, so 1994. I felt as if it would have just had too many ups and downs. It just would have been I'm not so sure I felt as if I had the writing skills. So I'm going to be completely honest with you, to hold that kind of narrative moving chronologically. So I thought the collective biography would hold better. And so I think I took that chance. I had some people read it, and there wasn't much pushback, though there were people who talked about the unevenness in terms of the length of the chapters. So, like, you know, James Cleveland's chapter, Shirley Caesar, Andre Crouch is pretty long. Vanessa Bell Armstrong's chapter is a little short, as is the Thompson Community Choir's chapter. But I felt like each chapter focused on a particular theme and had a certain narrative arc that I wanted to keep because I thought there was some integrity to that arc. I think, like, if I would have decided to just move chronologically, I think how if and we were focusing on, say, 1988, 1989. That's a year where those are 2 years where I'm not sure, like, Vanessa Bell Armstrong would have gotten those years. Because I think there were some other artists, if we're focusing on the commercial, it would have been overshadowing. And so in some ways, my decision to organize it in such a way was to really give full attention to the artistic development of a particular artist. There are problems with that because, for example, Andre Crouch, there's a lot of focus on his relationship to his white audience and sort of racism within the church, his sonic innovations. And, you know, I think one reviewer after it was published, sort of said, well, that doesn't come up again. And just to be honest, it doesn't come up again because there's no one else like him.
Mm.
I mean, BB and CC come pretty close. And at the same time, I think if I would have had a chapter that dealt with kind of questions around African American artists and white contemporary Christian music record labels and audiences, it would have simplified the complexity of that artist. And so I think at the end of the day, my goal was once again to select people that I don't think you could tell the story of this period and how it was experienced without. But the challenge of that is how someone was loved in 1988 may not be the ways in which they were remembered. They are remembered now.
Right.
So there are some artists that are like deities for us who actually had some commercial struggles in the 80s. And so there are some artists too who maybe were hugely popular among certain denominations, but it wasn't like always universal, right? So and there's no such thing as universal, but that was kind of shaping, I think, what I was doing. And I hope I answered that question for you. But that's what I'm thinking through. But I think it's also something you can do on your third book.
Look.
Maybe you have some leeway and then everybody could like beat it up and say, nah, this ain't happening. But there's other stuff coming out by younger scholars. I mean, I'm already talking to folks. That's going to be so much better than what I did. And I'm just trying to also, I think, lay not even a foundation, but build on the work that people like Jeremy Jackson and Guy Ramsey and, so many other artists, writers, Portia Malsby, Melanie Burnham, Aisha Jones. I mean, there's so many people doing some amazing stuff. So I'm just trying to build on that. And Robert Darnton, and create this space. Bob Maravich, and what's coming out next is going to be. I mean, it's some folks doing some amazing stuff. There's one guy, for example, working on a book on Thomas Whitfield, and it's going to be awesome, And so, like, to think about even someone like Thomas Whitfield, who was so innovative, but also who had some commercial struggles in the 80s, but so innovative and so at the cutting edge of the art form. And to now think about the ways that he's been elevated, to think about how Arthur Jaffa is basically using his video in like exhibits and at presentations and just like introducing him to a completely different group of folk. And so I think it's going to be, I'm really excited about the next group. And so if this can be a source book for the next generation, that's all I want to do. I just want to help advance the writing of gospel music.
And you did. And let me tell you, I'm very much loving, the work that you've been doing for a while now, and reading When Sunday Comes to me it's a book that I can give my mom, I can give to my aunties, and because to me a book like this provides an understanding of the world in which my mom grew up in as a Pentecostal Black girl in the 60s and the 70s in Brooklyn. And so, and she was reading some of the book, and it was like, usually I ask people now that I've gotten to this question of like, what are like the 5 to 10 books or 5 to 10 songs, right, that make up the kind of like the mixtape of the book. But then again, When Sunday Comes is that, right, personified, right, in chapter form. But for her, it was just a fun experience because it was like, oh, this is like the historical background of the music that she would listen to every single, Sunday and throughout the week. as well, because she was almost every day was church day because she was, involved, right, in the particular ways. Um, and so some of the things that she learned probably surprised her. But as you, as the writer of this book and also a self-professed a gospel music fan, while you were researching, did anything surprise you along the way?
Um, the genius, and it didn't surprise me. It overwhelmed me.
Mm.
The genius of Shirley Caesar. Shirley Caesar, and I'm familiar with her discography. I'm familiar with her legacy. I'm familiar with her politics. I mean, the same year that she recorded Hold My Mule, Shouting John, she won a seat on Durham City Council. That's just the expansiveness of her life. But her genius as a songwriter, as a performer, as a storyteller, as someone who's deeply rooted in African American history and oral traditions. And there was so much on her because she is so in control of her narrative. So, and she was also popular among critics, like New York Times critics and Washington Post. So the thing about her is you could always find these extensive articles. And I think so surprised is not the word, but just really overwhelmed by, I want somebody to put her in conversation with Zora Neale Hurston, thinking about the South, region, race, and class. And there are people who've done wonderful work like, I think it's Cheryl Saunders and Cheryl Gilkes, Professor Gilkes. And it was really overwhelming. Her genius. Andre Crouch, it is really hard to articulate and convey when there is no analog how popular he was. From like, there was a comic book that was like series that was devoted to him. But also just his range, right. His ability to do gospel, to do contemporary Christian music. But just the Andre Crouch mania was something. And not surprising, but it's nobody like James Cleveland. And I think he reinforced to me the importance of institution building. You know, the beauty about gospel music and is that it is also an art form that has been sustained by Black people and Black institutions. And to think about the Gospel Music Workshop of America emerging in the late 1960s, during the Black Power movement, during the Black arts movement, Black artist workshops, it's a part of that lineage. And to know that they still meet, they meet every year. And there are thousands of people who support this art form. In a moment where I think we still need models of institution building, it's a model for me. It's a model for you. I think it's a model for all of us who are also trying to create things, and sustain things and pass it on to the next generation and do things that honor the ancestors and the elders, that intergenerational transmission of knowledge and culture that's maintained by institutions. My mentor, Greg Carr, often says, people don't beat institutions. And so, not surprised me, but just it overwhelmed me. It provided me with joy. And that's what I felt, to quote Douglas Miller, like writing this book, unspeakable joy. Just proud, just like, like, wow. It's just like, and that's not to say that there weren't some tough moments. That's not to say that there are some things about the art form and the industry that, saddens me, but that kind of, that was overwhelming. Just like the genius, And like I said, I mean, James Cleveland, I mean, of course, you know, really Twinkie Clark,
Mm-hmm.
her mind just, you know, fascinated me. Um, and I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to just sit in their genius,
Yeah.
and that was really cool.
And it was great and cool to read. And so, obviously James Cleveland, as you just said, plays a central role in When Sunday
Mhm.
Comes and gospel music in general. So for those who might not necessarily be in the know of James Cleveland, but they will certainly after they hear this question and then follow up with reading and buying the book from the University of Illinois Press. Thank you so much. What were particularly unique qualities he held and developed that ultimately led to his rise, success, and his long-lasting legacy in Black sacred music?
Right. So one was he was an institution builder. He created the Gospel Music Workshop of America in 1967, and his idea was there needed to be a place where African Americans could sharpen their artistic skills, could gain more training in the art form and in the industry, and gain sort of economic autonomy. So that's the place where if you were a young artist, trying to break through, and that could be Kirk Franklin or John P. Key, because they all spent time at the Gospel Music Workshop of America. You attended that convention, but sometimes you were also a member of your state Gospel Music Workshop of America. So he really built an institution. He would often say, this is not about showcasing oneself. It's about building an institution. And so there's nothing comparable to that. There people who had conventions and seminars here in the art form, no doubt. Also, he was in the 60s and the 70s the biggest gospel artist. Peace Be Still was a million seller.
Mm.
It stayed on the top of the charts for like 5 years almost. It was not uncommon to get a Billboard magazine in the 1970s and the top 10 albums, like 7 of them were James Cleveland albums.
Wow.
So he was a commercial success. He was also an innovator. There's something distinctive about his piano playing. There's a particular style, which is why that's who Aretha Franklin was like, if I'm going to record Amazing Grace in 72 and I'm going to do this gospel album, I'm not doing it without James Cleveland. So he is a producer, he's a songwriter, he's a conceptualist, um, he's he's an arranger, he understands sound, but there's also story in his voice. And so when you hear James Cleveland, like who he is. I mean, there's something distinctive about him. He didn't have to hit a lot of notes, but he hit you right in the heart. He could, Marvin Winans talks about seeing him and how he could just say, I stood, and that's a song called I Stood on the Banks of the River Jordan, and people would just go crazy. When he says, Master, the tempest is raging. And that lets you know how bad Vanessa Bell Armstrong is, because she could cover that song. And sometimes when you say that, people think of his version and they also think of her version. So I would say institution builder, amazing commercial success. Whether you're talking about, just the songs, Where Is Your Faith? Lord, Help Me to Hold Out, Peace Be Still, God Is. I teach a class called From Motown to Hip Hop, and I have a lot of students who love Kanye. So I played his version of God Is.
Mm-hmm.
Then I played the James Cleveland version, and the students were like, whoa. He is a part of what I think is the greatest gospel album of all time, Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace.
Mm-hmm.
And how people felt about him can be captured when she said, sang James. I mean, that was him. So that singularity of his talent. No one was like him, but an institution builder. Because it's not just about your individual success, it's about building an institution. transmitting aspects of the culture to the next generation. And then I would just say lastly, he was on Savoy Records from like 1960 1960 until really the late 1980s. And basically, he was responsible for a lot of other people getting signed. And not just people that we know about, but you go to the record store, you'll find albums and you're like, who is this? But it'll be like James Cleveland presents so and so on. So that kind of expansive talent and just control, it was really singular. And I know Bob Maravich is coming out with a book with Illinois, just called on Peace Be Still, the recording of that
Oh
song or
wow.
that album in 1963. And so, yeah, he deserves a biography. He deserves a biography. So yeah, he is singular to me. Yeah, he's that dude.
Good. Yeah. Look, and one of the best parts about reading your book is like I was in a mode of just like playlist making.
Mm-hmm.
And so like reading this book, unlike many pretty much most, if not all others that I've done over the course of my podcast career, I'm just download. Oh, whole album, bet, let's do it. Like, and so you just blessed my listening and work experience, because sometimes I can actually say you disrupted it, because then I get the praising right quick and we getting jiggy with it, you know what I'm saying? So, a little praise break here and there, that's always good for the soul. And so what was even better for the soul, maybe not even better, but almost equal to that, was reading your third chapter. Look, now, personally, like I said, your third chapter, Hold My Mule, Shirley Caesar, and the Gospel of the New South, was definitely my favorite. But to
Yeah, I
many,
think that's the best chapter.
like, okay, for the author said it. The author said it, y'all. So I ain't capping. Like, the author said it herself. And so now here's the thing. To many listeners, when they hear or see the name Shirley Caesar, they remember the viral moment from a few years ago that clipped portions of Caesar's Hold My Mule sermonette. You demonstrate, though, that within the humor one can easily glean from the viral moment, we must remember that Hold My Mule displays, as, and I'm quoting you here, Caesar's unrivaled skills as a storyteller and her ability to capture the class tensions gripping Black America during the post civil rights era. So, Professor Harold, can you explain to the audience about the foundations of Caesar's storytelling ability? Because let me tell y'all, as Professor Harold said, and like I said, you gonna want to get this background to help you understand why Hold My Mule is so amazing. So, Dr. Harold, please.
Um, so you're talking about the song itself, or just
We could talk about the whole thing, her storytelling ability in
yeah,
general, the song, the sermonette as well, you know, because it's just amazing to me.
yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. It's on the eve of her 50th birthday when she records that song in Chicago, and multi Grammy Award winning artist. She's achieved everything you can achieve as an artist, and she felt as if she had been in a rut. And so she wanted to record this live album with the Thompson Community Choir singers, who also have a chapter in the book. And she records Hold My Mule, which is the story of an 86-year-old farmer, landowner, who joins what she calls a dead church. A church that doesn't believe in singing and speaking in tongues, and
Let's go. Let's go.
and there's a part of you though that says, why did John join that church?
Yep.
Some of this, John brought on himself for joining that church, but he joins a church that is troubled by his expressive religiosity, and so the deacons and the deaconess decide that they have to go out to John's house to let him understand and let him know that this not what they do. And so she tells the story of this confrontation between Shout and John and the deacon board, the usher board, we don't know. Or as she likes to say, dignitaries, church dignitaries. And they tell John, and so he walks over, and he looks at them coming out of there, and she say, fine cars, and he looks around and say, whole mule. And then he says, I know what you come out here to tell me. You come out here to tell me that I praise the Lord too much. And they threaten him with disfellowship and say, if you don't stop cutting the fool in church, we're going to throw you out because we have tried to, contain you. When you get happy in church, we have grabbed your legs and your arms are flowing and just, we've grabbed your arms and your feet are going. And so he begins to recount his blessings. And he says, look at all of this property, And so it's interesting to think about. He's talking about being an owner of property in 1989, 1988. And of course, we know this is a period in which a lot of Black farm owners, particularly in North Carolina, have lost land. In fact, there's a lawsuit that happens, I think, in 1988, 1989. And so there's this confrontation, and he just begins to recount his blessing. He says, not one time have I been to the courthouse. Not one time have I been to the cemetery. But you don't want me to dance in your church. And he begins to shout all over his, all over his property. And there's so many interesting things about that because I think what she's capturing is also the class tensions. People who believe in this sort of politics of respectability that you're supposed to act a certain way. But she complicates the narrative because clearly this is a person who is quite successful, but he's not bragging. He's not talking about his material possessions as something that he's achieved because of his own unique talents, but he's achieved them as a result of God's grace.
Right.
And so what she does in this song is in many ways she illuminates for us and brings to the forefront these class tensions that exist in Black America. And that's a theme in a lot of her music, like the song, her popular 1969 song, Don't Throw Your Mama Away. It's always these, what's happening in terms of class politics in a post-civil rights moment. But she has the crowd, throughout the song, and they're just hanging on her every word. And she just brings it. And of course, if you've seen Shirley Caesar live, when she says, I'm going to shout all over this place, she shouts all over this place. Nobody can shout and dance like Shirley Caesar. And whether you see her perform this in Chicago or whether you see this performing in her classic live video that came out in Memphis, she's shouting to the rhythm of the band and shouting to the rhythm of the spirit. But it's just an amazing, it's storytelling at its best. It embodies what James Weldon Johnson talked about when he talked about the Black sermonic tradition. That's what she brings. And that's what she brings to that song. And to think about her recording that song after, say, 9 years at Word Records, where she had recorded songs that had a contemporary gospel feel, a disco feel. Like her first album with Word in 1980, Rejoice, she cuts it with the legendary country producer Tony Brown. So you can hear disco, but she also covers Bob Dylan, who just celebrated, of course, his 80th birthday. You Gotta Serve Somebody, which for me is one of the best Bob Dylan covers ever. But she just had this incredible, incredible range. And that is evident on Hold My Mule, but evident on the album from which it emerges, Live in Chicago, which she also has a song called The Blood, in which she dedicates to, quote, the AIDS victims. So she's also one of the first gospel artists to kind of talk about this disease, this pandemic that's affecting a lot of folks in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's always, you know, forward thinking. So in a moment, in a year in which BBNCC and Take Six have gold albums, Billboard awards her album the greatest gospel album of the year.
Mm.
And so she's a genius. And because she is, as she would say, a woman of God, and this is the difficulty of grappling with someone like a Shirley Caesar and also Albernita Twinkie Clark, because they attribute their genius to spirit. They're not going to sit and talk about all the instruments they play and all the songs that they have written and all of the artistic innovations that they have made over the course of their career. So part of your job as a writer is to really put some of those things up front, because they just don't do it in that way. So oftentimes when we discuss even the transformations and the advances in gospel music, I don't think we give Shirley Caesar enough credit. But disco, funk, she did it all. And she traversed the world of contemporary gospel and traditional gospel. But she was never going to kind of sit there and say, I'm a major innovator and I sit in the studio all day and think of these ideas, because no, she's just doing the work of God. But she also has kind of this hardcore working class, kind of work ethic that is just about, she's just putting in the work. But that particular song means a lot to me. And if you were listening to gospel music, gospel radio, and I'm pretty sure your mom could attest to this, like it was nothing to hear that song like 2-3 times in an hour. And the thing about it is, it sounded fresh all the time. And so that remix, we got greens, potatoes, all of that, it's so interesting. And I just hope people also understand like the context in which that comes, because she's also highlighting people and communities that were still kind of rooted in the soil and still, rooted in the land and farming and all of those things, because she's also talking about nature and food and what we have as what we need to really nourish us.
Yep.
So it's like really important, but it's like, Shirley Caesar she's a rock star and a rap star, as that song indicated. So for her to have that kind of success or that kind of revival in 2016, which also occurred, alongside with her, doing a soundtrack for It's Escaping Me. What's that Sunday, that show about the church?
Was it Greenleaf? Yeah.
And so she had that song, she had Satan, I'm gonna tear your kingdom down, right? So it's like people are constantly rediscovering her and just falling in love with her again. And that was the beautiful thing. I fell in love with Shirley Caesar so many times.
And you're so it's fascinating. So my dearly departed grandma Eva, before I knew who Shirley Caesar was, I knew okay, I'm not gonna say she hated Shirley Caesar. God forgive me. But she was not a fan, for the simple fact of, you said this earlier in your comment, she can the particular performance element, right, in terms of like, she extra in all the best ways, right? My grandmama she wasn't a fan. So before I even knew who Shirley Caesar was, I knew I had the outside influence of my grandmother. So it was around the time, like as I got older and I started to, started listening to gospel music on my own, started to develop my own appreciation. But in particular, Tear Your Kingdom Down is actually my favorite, because like, and this is why. So like, I recently purchased a subscription to YouTube Music, because I realized I really enjoy the live performances, and the Spotify's and the iTunes and the titles usually don't give you like the full, the fullness that a YouTube can. And I say that because I was listening to so apparently Lovecraft Country in their soundtrack actually sample, or they used rather Tear Your Kingdom Down. And for some reason, the particular version that they did, it's just so soul stirring. And so I got that on one of my playlists, and whenever it comes on, oh, it's time to get working. It
Right.
just does that. It just focuses my mind in a particular way. Like it's just probably one of my favorite songs.
Yeah, and if you love that song, you'll probably love too "Don't Be Afraid." It also has that kind of a cappella sound. And her dad, who died very young, I think he was in his 40s, and she was just a little girl. But he was known as one of the best singers in North Carolina. He was a part of the Just Come Quartet, who really played a key role in the popularity of quartets in North Carolina. But yeah, I mean, she's she's also interesting because she comes from like the holiness tradition and Mount Calvary. And so that's something we haven't talked about. But for me, and as somebody who really doesn't regularly go to church anymore, but for me, that was also something that I really had to learn, like, and not learn, but learn, but understand the different denominations within this. So, like this, you got Kojic, you got, holiness, you got Mount Calvary, you got, Baptist with James Cleveland, you got Sanctified Baptist, you got non-denominational, so you also had all of these denominations that also shape the music and also shape the message sometimes. And so that was another thing of learning. And I know with her, because I was just like always trying to figure out, like, I think about Miles Davis. He used to tell, I guess, Tony Williams, the drummer, to go spy on Wayne Shorter, because Shorter was coming out with all these great songs. Like, what does he do? Like, just, and that's how I felt sometimes with Shirley Caesar. Like, I just wanted to, what she read? Like, just like it's something that's deeper than just kind of surface level. But someone who's like the genius just really fascinates you. I mean, like I said, Twinkie Clark is like that. I remember Carol Cooper, great writer and music critic, cultural critic. She interviewed Twinkie Clark, and she once asked her, about like what did she listen to, and did she listen to jazz and and different art forms, and she says, I don't listen, but I hear. I don't listen, but I hear. And so, it's like you got to find a way. So that's why when you ask me about interviewing people, I think it's an interesting dynamic, because you can interview people, but you have to read between the lines and understand, like, what she's saying is, I don't listen, but I hear. She's also speaking as someone who's coming from a certain kind of church tradition where she can't just be, it's like balancing that artistic genius and innovation and experimentation with, also your calling and all of those things. And also, we're supposed to be always moved by the Spirit. So sometimes it kind of disciplines the ways in which you talk about being moved by other artistic traditions, especially if those things come out of they don't come out of the church. But I mean, like, anybody who listens to Twinkie Clark, knows that she's been listening to Stevie Wonder and Herbie Hancock and all of those things. So, like, there's a part of me, and I think that's why I'll try to extend this book into probably like a website or something. Like, I just want to know, like, what she was doing at Howard, like that, because actually some of those Howard folks are on her solo albums from 79 and 78, 79 and 80. But, I'm like interested in how people are made. So that's like a story that I also want to tell, like, how geniuses, innovators, they're not born, they're made. And so yeah.
And that's very important what you've extended for us here, because the artistry opens folks up to world changing experiences, right? Because this is music that is played in church, played in your most, you spoke about the fact that in 2017, what gospel music did for you, right? In terms of the particular time frame, and obviously what was going on in Charlottesville. And so it makes me also think about the way that gospel music and Black sacred musical performers have actually navigated the politics of the eras that birthed them, and that their work was came into being. And so how did, and you had spoken about this with Shirley Caesar, but I wonder what other stories you can let the folks know to discuss how did the artists in When Sunday Comes navigate this quickly changing world, especially as the HIV/AIDS and crack epidemics were ravaging Black communities, especially during the Reagan era in the early 90s.
Yeah, so it's major, and they are trying to respond to a shifting economic landscape, post-industrialization, a deindustrialization, excuse me, um, the urban crisis, um, class stratification and difference within the African American community, um, AIDS, um, natural disaster. And so, and also like the rise of the Christian right.
Say that.
And so, as some white Christian institutions begin to integrate and begin to open things up for some African American performers, they are also presented with, or they encounter certain strands of conservatism that's different from the strands of conservatism that's kind of, sort of rooted in their communities. And so one of the things that we see are artists addressing these problems in terms of the urban crisis, in terms of crime, in terms of deindustrialization. So, for example, in Detroit, you have a group of artists who are navigating a city that's dealing with massive population loss, the loss of unionized, high-paying jobs, the fracturing or the alleged fracturing of the family, what some would call a gender crisis, a crisis in gender identities, questions around sexuality. And so you hear it in the music, and it's particularly profound, I think, in the music of the Winans, the quartet, the Winans. And so they talk about everything, international issues, domestic issues. And they also demonstrate how you can never use one descriptive to explain the politics. They take on what we may call liberal positions, liberal positions, progressive positions, and they also have some deeply conservative lyrics. And so they are attempting to make sense of, the world. They are attempting to make sense of, what's going on in Afghanistan in the early 80s. They're attempting to deal with the Cold War, or the legacies of the Cold War. Apartheid, so in 1985, when most Christian artists are silent about apartheid, the Winans released Let My People Go, which is their first single on Quincy Jones' Warner Brothers imprint Quest Records. And it is a song that critiques apartheid. It is a song that aligns itself with the global struggle against apartheid. So it shouldn't surprise us that in 1990, in June of 1990, when Nelson Mandela visits Detroit, and the three-bit singers on the headline, Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, and the Winans. Interestingly enough, the Winans at the time had a number 5 album on the R&B charts with the Teddy Riley produced It's Time. It's time to make that change. And when you listen to that song, you hear, the voice of one of my favorite singers of any genre, Marvin Winans, but talking about, diseases are spreading mighty fast, and earthquakes are moving through the land. That's the year after the San Francisco earthquake.
Right.
So they're talking about all of these issues. And one of the interesting things about that song, and I've been writing about this and thinking about this lately, is it's a way in which Teddy Riley's New Jack Swing, the kind of angst in the music and the kind of jagged edges in that New Jack Swing sound, it fit perfectly with the message that the Winans were giving, trying to confront a Detroit that's rapidly changing, trying to deal with a post-King, post-industrial, post-Motown world.
Mm.
And I remember in 91, I think it was 91, I visited Detroit. This is how much
Mm-hmm.
I went to Marvin Winans' church, Perfecting. And I remember I'm a kid and I was talking to him, I love your music. And he was talking about, I think it was Daniel, his brother Daniel. BB and CC had already left Detroit for Nashville. And he was like, it's me and I think Ronald. He was basically saying, most of my brothers and sisters have left the city. So one of the things that I often kind of think about was like, as you're experiencing this kind of socioeconomic reality, but one that's also shaping family life and community life, how do you theologically make sense of that?
Whew.
And so I think people make sense of it in terms of very involved in politics. So even if you look at their political leanings, they've supported Democratic mayors, but they've also supported Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
But understanding how people are trying to make sense of that and how it begins to evidence itself in the music. And so at the same time, it's in that music where you hear certain kind of themes about sexuality. So I think about one of their songs from their album Tomorrow called, I think it won a Grammy, Bring Back the Days of Yay and Nay. I remember when life was so simple.
Mm-hmm.
You did or you didn't, you would or you wouldn't, but it ain't like that anymore. And then it was like, parents were a light. Through them, you understood what was right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But then they had a line where it say, women were women and men were men.
Lord.
So part of, the good old days was this kind of alleged gender conformity. Now, of course, if we know anything about the church,
Yep.
gospel music,
Say that.
I mean, but that's what people are navigating. And that's what a young teenager like myself, that's also something you're listening to.
Mm-hmm.
And so as people are trying to wrestle with all of these things, you begin to hear it in the music. So you hear it in the Winans, you hear it in Commission, you hear it in the Clark sisters. Ashley, Twinkie and Marvin have a song called Word of God, where they re-articulate some of those things that I just talked about. At the same time, the Clark sisters have a song called Good Hands. I'm in good hands. And it's a line that Twinkie has where she says, God's economics beat Reaganomics.
Mm.
And so it's also like this way in which you can never fully, people can't be simplified. You can't put people in one box. But I am interested in how some of that language and some of those ideas begin to circulate in such a way that people are introduced to some of these themes that we associate with like a moral majority. But the great writer and civil rights activist Wyatt T. Walker, in his book, Somebody's Calling My Name, says that what Black people are singing religiously will tell you what's happening to them sociologically. Kind of paraphrasing it. Mm-hmm. And so I think you see that throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s. You sort of see that in the music. So that's why even today I look at some of the, I'm trying to get more into contemporary artists like Lecrae and trying to understand what some of those folks are doing and how, I'll say this, even some of the artists who like have identified with like Black Lives Matter and talk about police brutality, there's a kind of openness and a frankness to me in this moment that I didn't see always, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but saw a little bit of it in the 80s. And so it's also interesting to see how people have changed. And so, like I said, the same person who could write a song about apartheid could be the same person who promotes George Bush because of a position on gay marriage and could be the same person who tells their congregation to not vote for Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I'm saying all of that to say understanding those complexities. But that gets to your original question when you asked me about interviewing people. Sometimes I read interviews from people that are so, they contrast so much from what I heard in the 80s or the 90s. And so sometimes you have to kind of just step back and try to make sense of it yourself.
And that comes to being a nimble interviewer as well. Sometimes you gotta be able. Sometimes the notes are on paper. Sometimes they gotta also be in your head, because sometimes you don't get the chance to, specifically if it's in a live interview versus looking back to it. But once again, you still got to be nimble enough to be able to triangulate. You know, okay, you've changed a little bit. Because I'll say this, like with anybody, right? You talk to, I'll say this, as a kid, if I don't know how my mom would feel if she knew that her 5-year-old baby would live to have long locks, earrings, tattoos, and once this once this dissertation proposal is defended and I get that full candidacy, a gold grill, she'd be like, my baby, my But here's the thing: if you would have locked her in 1997, she would have said something. But in 2021, things are different, right? But then again, that's hopefully most of us in many of our positions in life as things come down.
Let me just say this though. I think part of the job as a scholar with a little bit of ethics is also to be honest about what you can and what you can't do. There is a
Amen.
lot to be said about the politics of gender and sexuality. And I'm hoping like certain chapters help people who I think are going to engage that even more. But it's not my gift, and so I think also like you have to understand like your research skills, your writing skills, and you have to be honest about the kind of book that you want to write.
Mm-hmm.
Not the book that someone else wants to read, but the book that you want to write. Because, like I said, I think there are aspects of certain artists like James Cleveland that I think people would have wanted me to say certain things about. And I think that's for, I think I talked about some of those things that I think is very, like, I think he needs a biography.
Mm-hmm.
So just one chapter on certain people, it's not going to cut it. But I think you have to be honest too about the book that you want to write and the book that, what you want to say and how you want to contribute. And that doesn't mean that you aren't open to criticism. That doesn't mean that you should push yourself intellectually. But we are a complex people with complex stories.
Mm-hmm.
And stories that need to be told multiple times from multiple perspectives.
Indeed, right? Because we have, no one should get the final say, right? We had Monty Perry's bio of Lorraine Hansberry that came out a couple years ago, and now we have Dr. Gilbert over at Georgetown's new one that's I think just dropped this month, if not this week, and so no one should have the final say because everybody got their own perspective and something to add. So that's actually a really good one for me to think about as well, and especially once you start to get comments from outside. I'm not going to call them agitators, but outside folk about the project. So, but this is actually an interesting segue for the next question about challenges. And so this is an amazing book that, I think, like you said, is going to provide a lot of foundations for people to learn about gospel music, but to also understand how this work gets done, right? Because gospel music is not only the music that we hear, but there's a whole heck of a lot of production that goes on for us to even hear folks, right? In terms of practice and such. And so that encounters some challenges. But for you as the writer and the constructor of When Sunday Comes, what was some of the biggest challenges that you faced in the production of this text?
So I think one of the challenges was sort of one of the challenges was internal, in that I needed to commit myself fully to writing this book for your mother.
Mm.
And that 11, 12-year-old girl who bought all these albums and read Billboard and Totally Gospel, and not to try to write a book that would seek success among people who had no interest in gospel music. And so one of the challenges involved also not writing a book that only treated gospel as important as a precursor to something else.
Mm-hmm.
So when I first started working on this book, and I would talk to some of my colleagues about the book, or people who were not familiar with gospel music, the first thing that they would ask me was, when did Mahalia Jackson die? And
Really?
Yeah. And what that meant was, that's really the only gospel singer that I've heard of. So I knew that I wanted to write a book that would be so engrossing and entertaining and good and deeply researched that even if you didn't know about the art form, you would want to read it. But I didn't want the rock and roll world, the soul world, hip hop to be the entry point all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't want to write a book that I had to lead with Kanye West recording God Is for you to want to keep reading about James Cleveland.
Right.
And so I think one of the challenges was being honest about the book's audience.
Mm-hmm.
And being honest about your desire to write for people who have a deep interest in this history, who may not know all of the history, but who want to know the backstory, and who are a part of a community that has sometimes been dismissed as not being interested in this story. So one of the problems, this is why Mark Anthony Neal is actually so important. Mark Anthony Neal, through his work from Soul Babies to What the Music Said, and also his work with Pop Matters, I think really created space for Black writers who didn't just want to cover traditional soul or hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
There was, as one of my colleagues said, there ain't no Teddy Pendergrass studies. And so what we mean, artists that Black people deeply love, that may not have crossed over. I mean, he did, but who, still sold a lot of records. Not every artist needed to cross over to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes there's this idea that what matters is the music that crossed over.
Right.
And so really, to be honest with you, perfectly honest with you, I had to be very clear. No, I'm gonna have a chapter on Vanessa Bell Armstrong.
There it is.
Well, we never heard of her. Oh yeah, but but I know thousands who have heard of her.
Right.
So to be honest, that was a challenge, to not sensationalize the story. So those were two important challenges: to have a certain clarity about who you wanted your audience to be, and to be fine with that,
Mm-hmm.
and to be fine with the results that would bring about, because filmmaking has taught me that. In the sense that sometimes if the entry is not white supremacy, if the entry is not Black people as objects,
Right.
what we do with this. So, I mean, I've done films with Kevin Everson and they played all around the world. But sometimes when we screen film, someone said, well, why don't you have a part in the film like where black people getting beat up doing it? So it's because that's not the kind of film that we're making. But the point is, it's like that's what you want to center. No, we don't make stuff about Confederate monuments. It's not to say that that work isn't important, but that's not what we do. But sometimes there's a push to make it, oh, but that's what you should be doing. No, y'all can do that. But I'm going to make a film about, Black Greek life.
Mm-hmm.
Because the interiority of our lives matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be, I think with gospel music, you have to be very clear about that. On the flip side, I had to be very clear that like that artist that you love, that you watch on YouTube, to hit them 10 notes that you love to watch, but they couldn't sell 10 records in the 1980s. I'm not putting them in there. No, I'm not joking. But so I think there's also this kind of, I had to also be very clear about the artists that I wanted to focus on. And I think some people may think that I put too much emphasis on kind of the commercial success.
Right.
But I think that when there's a bunch of people who can agree upon your greatness and they agree upon it by purchasing your album, like to me, like that matters. And so that also meant, being very specific about Claudrena, stay in 1985. Sometimes I had to stay in 1985 and not 2015 memories of 1985. And embrace my position as a historian, but also as a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
And listen to that voice as well. And so that was, in some ways, those were challenges. The archives, to me, the challenge is the state of them, not my access to them. So that's the thing that I worry about a lot. But it was, the archives were pretty good. So I would say that was, those are the big challenges, being clear about the audience and also overcoming my fears about not knowing some of the technicalities of music. And sometimes when you rely, to treat these folks as artists and not just as a entry point into some kind of sociological conversation. So to take the art seriously.
Mm-hmm. And that to me, that final part about taking the art seriously, because I think at the end of the day, the people that you're writing about are not only the artists, but you yourself as the writer is an artist as well. And that's not only because you are a filmmaker, but also your role as a historian is an artistic role. Hence why some people's writing ability is phenomenal and some, it's not, it's not as great, but maybe their research, their deep, archival ability to weave stories together can be, one of their greatest assets. And so to me, you're you Dr. Claudrena Harold, you know what I'm saying? Like you out here. And not only you are a chair of a department. So my goodness, Lord bless you. For real. And so and also your comments here bring to mind this next question too as a good transition. And so one thing When Sunday Comes makes clear is that there is a major difference between CCM, contemporary Christian music, and gospel music, and specifically of the Black variety here. Unless you're, I guess, Paula White trying to, Africa, whatever. And on a side note, it really makes me so annoyed that her church base is in Orlando, not far from the Orlando area where I grew up, but that's a whole nother story. But as you take stock of the sonic landscape and see the popularity of things like, Hillsong and Elevation Music and other CCM acts, sometimes they're also bringing people who you would consider as gospel artists into their orbit. I'm glad you could see me as I say this. What/who do you see ultimately as the future of gospel music? I know that's a lot, but I'm very much interested to know, what your thoughts are about this back and forth, kind of like this volley, but also looking forward. Like, what is the future of gospel music as a genre?
I don't know. Because to me, the future of gospel music is so intertwined with the question of the future of the Black church
Mm.
and also the future of the music industry. And, it's interesting that you mentioned something like Hillsong, because I also feel as if so many artists who are now music directors at these mega churches,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually a major source of income. It's hard to answer that question when the industry is just different. And so I can't think of anyone. I think if you asked me in 1996,
Mm-hmm.
I would have said Kirk Franklin.
Right.
And not just because he was so huge, but because as a result of his success and, Gospel Centric, which was a Black owned label, and you had Trinity 5-7, and it just it's hard to say. I mean, in a post versus moment, I've been watching a lot of like SWV interviews. Lord
Mm-hmm.
help me. And I've been listening to Coco talk about the industry and this very question. And she's talking about A&R, and it's interesting because I think we see record labels as oppressive, and they kind of are. But she was talking about a certain kind of, I think, quality control
Mm-hmm.
that you used to have that's just different now. Um, I feel like sometimes when I hear people talk about gospel singers and performers, someone is like showing you a YouTube clip of somebody performing like on, I don't know, in their house, in their studio, and it's like they're hitting the right notes,
Mm-hmm.
and we're watching them live on Instagram, and it's so different. So it's hard for me to really say what the future is. What I hope the future is artistic innovation, spiritual depth,
Mm.
and political engagement. Um, is it Lecrae? Am I saying that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, because of the book and because people kept asking me about the contemporary moment,
Yeah.
I started listening to him more, and there's some interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I just never been into gospel, and I know he would hate this term gospel rap. That's but
Yeah.
I can't say that has come a long ways from like the 80s, because it
Mm-hmm.
used to be some horrible like gospel rap, gospel hip hop. But I mean, it's like I'm not as familiar with that. But I mean, and there are great singers. Um, everything seems so fragmented and disparate for me.
Yeah.
Um, who do you like?
Good question. So I would say Jonathan McReynolds. I like. He's done some really good music. Um, Actually, he was on a song on Common's most recent album that I really liked. I forget its name, but let me see. So what's interesting is like in terms of people that I can say are contemporary, right? But I think that the shadow of Kirk Franklin looms so large because he's still working. I think that is the part. Like I still remember driving from, well, not me literally driving, but me being in the passenger seat with my great aunt, Mimi, dearly departed, and I kid you not, we listened. I forget what album it was, but we listened to one that had Stomp and Revolution on it, and we drove up from Palm Beach all the way up to Dalzell, South Carolina, right outside of Sumter. Like, and I kid you not, I was as you know this term, I was a jit. I was a jit. Like, and I just remember we were just bumping, like we was just going. But it's like so much of the gospel music that I listen to, and this is not me like hearkening and calling for a return to the 70s, 80s, or the 90s, but it's like, damn. But I'm like, damn, I'm like, or even the early 2000s, right? So that's why I think, trying to think about on the spot, like who are people, who are artists that I can directly root in my generation, I'll say, for folks who are like I guess 30 and younger. Yeah, so I'll just say honestly, Jonathan McReynolds is someone who I bump with a lot.
Yeah. I mean, Kurt Franklin, it's interesting that you say in the shadow of Kurt Franklin, because I also feel that way with someone like Fred Hammond, who, if he releases something, I'm going to listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
And, or if I hear that Marvin Winans was at a church and he was just singing a hymn, I'm going to go listen to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like there, so it's interesting, but Kurt Franklin, the magnitude of his impact and the deep love that people had for him is really hard but necessary to convey. And when his debut came out, it was like a seismic shift. And for me, 94 is a transitional year in gospel music. And that's why I ended the book really in 94. BB and CC broke up after having 3 like consecutive gold and platinum albums, something that gospel artists just didn't do.
Right.
Sounds of Blackness came out with their second album. Fred Hammond, I think, officially left commission that year. And Kurt Franklin's debut, which came out in 1993, was just storming the charts and storming the gospel charts. Then it was crossing over. And that wasn't new. In some ways, that crossover success. I mean, like BB and CC had number 1 R&B songs, Addictive Love, Heaven, kind of celebrity status. Their best friend is Whitney Houston, who literally in the late 80s, it was not uncommon to go to one of their concerts and she would be singing background. But the thing about Kurt Franklin that I distinctively remember and was so special was that Black church people also claimed him as their own. It was like the bling, not the bling bling era of gospel, but it was a TD Jakes. It was that moment where I think gospel folks wanted somebody big too. So Kirk was unique in that he didn't just cross over, because that's not the most important part of the story. I mean, what people don't often talk about that first album is it didn't immediately cross over. And part of the reason it got on the charts was a little crossover, but so many gospel people were buying that album in, Circuit City, called an old store, Circuit City. Coconuts, they were buying that album, and like people were so proud. And I feel that's not to say there wasn't criticism, but they could claim him as their own. He had come through Gospel Music Workshop of America. He didn't come through like BB and CC, PTL.
Yep.
You know what I mean? He was like your own. And my graduation, they sung Silver and Gold. You could not go to a church without somebody, doing The Reason Why We Sing. So that little kid who always did the Martin Luther King speech on MLK Day, he was going to, somebody asked the question, everybody, it was a cultural phenomenon. And in some ways, it was that combination of kind of like the crossover success of the Winans and the Clark sisters and BB and CC, combined with like the phenomena, the kind of the out of this world popularity of John P. Key. When John P. Key would come out with an album from basically the late 89 and 93, if you didn't get to that mom and pop store by noon on a day of the release, because they didn't have a lot of, it wasn't a lot of CDs or tapes, you wasn't going to get the album. And so Kirk had that kind of feel, and it made all of us, and I'm saying us as a person who, in the book, he's not like he's not the most, there are other artists who are more, who I like a lot more, who I was more fans of. I think when Kirk came, I was kind of leaving gospel a little bit. Mm-hmm. But the impact, what it felt like, you felt like you were in a movement. Mm-hmm. And that was from the first album. And then when What You Looking For came out, well, first of all, it was the Christmas album in between.
Look, that Christmas album. Oh my Lord, goodness gracious. Right.
So yes. And then when Melody, I can remember being in a locker room with my teammates at Temple and hearing, like, you know, melodies from heaven, like people going crazy. And, you know, and at the same time, like, I got teammates who love Sounds of Blackness. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. Like, gospel was very much a part of the everyday. And then, like, when it moved to God's Property, ooh, because he actually, you know, you went from huge in gospel, you got to have a Kirk Franklin album. And see, this is an important thing about gospel fans. And you'll have some artists who are critical of this. Like, okay, some people, you listen to gospel on the radio. You may have recorded the gospel song from the radio on your cassette. Mm-hmm. You purchased certain people. But, you know, Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace went gold in 1972. There was not another gold album by a gospel artist until 88 with BB and CC. Goodness. Then Take 6, 89. Then the Winans, 90 with Return. So I'm saying all of that to say, and then BB and CC again with Different Lifestyles, which went platinum. I'm saying all of that to say, I just mentioned like 4 albums, 2 by the same people in the same family. Mm-hmm. That's how huge the Winans are, you know. And I feel like sometimes in this current moment, sometimes people forget that. But then Kirk came along, and the album is just going up, you know, on the top of the charts. And then Trinity 5-7, then Yolanda, you know, who's always been big in gospel. So you had this moment from 94 to really 2000. That gospel is just Fred Hammond, first platinum album with pages, chapters in the pages in the chapter. I can never get that right. But it was like, it was a great moment. And I was so happy for gospel artists. And I'm not trying to kind of fetishize sales, but it makes your life better. See, part of it is my uncle was in the music industry, you know, mm-hmm. and, you know, his hits in, you know, What a Man, that song was a sample of one of his songs, Candy State and Young Hearts Run Free. B.B. King, I Like the Little Life That I Sing About. My cousin, Jackie Moore, Precious, Precious, that was a gold album. But I know what life is like, too, when you don't sell. Mm-hmm. And I know, so for people to sell and be able to tour and be able to support themselves, and as a result, what you saw with Kirk is constantly just pushing the art forward, you know. And it was amazing, and it was cool. And he went from, then you could see him on MTV. Like, Stomp was played on MTV. Right. And so that was like, you know, it reminded me of a time I never forget. I saw BB and CC's Lost Without You playing on Guiding Light, one of the stories, mm-hmm. like, you know, in a part that, you know, they shouldn't be playing a gospel song. But it was also what people would accuse them of, was this lyrical ambiguity. Mm. That they made these songs where they just said he or she or this and that, and they wrote differently. And that was cool. That was some of the criticism of Andre Crouch. But, you know, Kirk is like, Jesus should love me so. It's so, I mean, like, it just was church. Mm-hmm. And then you had all of these people in the secular world. And that's always with gospel artists, whether it's, you know, Quincy Jones asking Andre Crouch, like, hook me up with Color Purple. It's always that with gospel artists. And so, yeah, I've said too much, but like those moments we have to really like capture. And here's the thing about Kirk Franklin. Those are our moments.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
If he play at the BET Awards, everybody gonna know that song.
Yep.
It may be different at the Grammys.
Mm-hmm.
This is the way I look at it, and I talk about this in the book. Michael Jackson's homegoing service.
Whew.
Soon and very soon, Andre Crouch. Whitney Houston's homegoing service. Marvin Winans, Let the Church Say Amen, written by Andre Crouch. So gospel music is central to what we do.
Yep.
It is a central component of the culture. And yeah, so you didn't ask me that question, but one of the reasons I stopped in Kirk with 94, because I knew I had to talk about Kirk Franklin. I also knew I didn't want to talk about the internet and reality shows. So I knew like I didn't want to like go into Mary too much. Yeah. So I was very intentional because it's just with reality shows and all of that, it's just something else. But I would just say I wrote for people who, after getting off a long day's work, hard day's work, will turn on the radio and will hear Juvenile's Back That Thing Up and then Donnie McClurkin's We Fall Down and not skip a beat.
Amen. See, I love that because, and I say that because there have been many nights in the club where, Stomp will come on, a Revolution, and everybody, you can be drunk as a skunk. Look, I'll tell on myself, you can be drunk as a skunk, but once Stomp come on, once Revolution come on, or my actual favorite Kirk and and I think it was I forget who, I can never remember. I'm looking at it right now, but Riverside. That is my jam. When I think about whenever I'm writing, that's a song that when it comes on, it reminds me, right? I'm thinking about Harriet Tubman. I'm thinking about Ona Judge. I'm thinking about, all the revolutionary runaways who and those who are not able to get away. I think about them when I think about Riverside. But also in the last year and a half, I don't know, there's a version of Melodies of Heaven, a skate remix. That's actually my preferred version of Melodies from Heaven, because I'm like it's just so somber, but it's still like gets you kind of hype, but in kind of like a lo-fi kind of mode. So look, so you've kind of answered a little bit of some of the next questions, but I want to move up a little bit and ask, what was the funnest part about writing When Sunday Comes?
The travel. The moment of discovery that you get when traveling and going into the archive. And remember, the archive for me could be a church.
Exactly. Yep.
And yeah, the moment of discovery. So I was in Detroit in June of 2018, and I'm so glad I didn't know. I knew that Aretha Franklin was sick, but I didn't know the extent, because she is the alpha and omega, the beginning and the end for me. Mm-hmm. And I went to Bethel Baptist Church, C.L. Franklin's church, her dad's church, and so many other churches in Detroit, gated, closed. Mm-hmm. You can't just walk in there. The door was open. And I kept walking around the church. And somebody came out of the church and they said, "Hey, sister, come on in." And I didn't want to, because I had a Funkadelic shirt on that in the back it said, free your mind, your ass will follow. I'm not gonna. I do have some home training, so I'm not about to go into church with that shirt on. And it's around 1:00 or something, because when I hit the streets early, and he said, "Oh, come on!" How somebody giving you a heart. So I went into the church, and man, the spirit of that church. And to see those pictures of Aretha Franklin and Dr. King. And so that's so fun for me. Earlier that day, or really late that night, the day before, a dear friend of mine picked me up, and it's like pitch black. Detroit. I got my camera, and I hit King Solomon Church. That's where the first gospel music workshop was held, and I took pictures. So fun for me is also taking pictures of these spaces. So I took a lot of the pictures, the pictures that are in the book, because one challenge was Gettys.
Yep.
Man, they're like arm and a leg.
Yep.
So those pictures are like $500 a pop.
Yep.
So I never forget, I'm complaining, and my colleague Kevin was like, Claudrena, just shoot pictures yourself. And so I became obsessed with taking pictures of like street names, and they had been named for gospel artists. And so, but that's the funnest part for me. Just like that Detroit experience, man, Bethel. And I just sit down, and sat in the pew. And I thought about James Cleveland being there and the training that he provided.
Yep.
I thought about, the Republic of New Africa and some of the Black nationalist stuff that organizations. And I thought about 1987 when she recorded that album with Thomas Whitfield, and just to be there and just to sit there. And so it was amazing. And that next, I left there and I walked from Bethel to Shrine of the Madonna.
Whew.
And then I walked from there to Motown. And then what became very clear to me is that all of this is in walking distance. So what emerges out of that moment are sounds that are shaping each other. So, they all are emerging from this space. And then I hit God's World, which is a Black-owned record store that's right across the street from Bishop Sherrod's. I never say his name. Bishop Sheard. His church. And I walk over there just to get a picture of Karen Clark's parking spot.
That is.
That's what I care about now. And being in God's World, this guy Larry Robinson, who's really close to the owner of Sound of Gospel, which the Clark sisters recorded on, but also he owned Westbound Records, and that was like Ohio Players, Parliament, Funkadelic. And I was like asking him questions. So he tells me stories of, before they made it big, Commission used to practice in one of my stores.
Wow.
And he used, at one point, he owned like a lot of, there were a lot of different stores. And then I asked him questions about like the Clark sisters. He's like, turn your recorder off.
Oh.
And it wasn't bad. But I had these questions about, which the film on them kind of touched on a little bit, but questions about, record contracts and all of these things that I had heard. And by the time he finished, I knew about so many things, from Dr. Mattie Clark,
right?
Mattie Moss Clark, to George Clinton.
Whew.
And most of it, some of it I was able to quickly, because I had somebody else with me to write it down.
Yeah.
But what I also learned was the most important lesson was not in a quote. He was like, sit here and let me tell you. See, you have to feel the story. You have to know the story. You have to gain a respect for the story. And that's what he gave me. So like sometimes so there's certain things, like even watching the movie, I was like, no, that's different than what I heard.
Right.
But that's not, so what you learn too is like, that's some of the things we think are important are not important.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that you learn is the conditions under which people make this music. You can never fully explain or communicate or make public. Some things you don't want to make public.
Right.
Some things aren't for a kind of mass consumption where we question the business acumen of certain people. That's one of the things I didn't like about some of the conversation on social media doing the Clark Sisters, that movie about publishing rights and stuff. I'll just say this. None of those conversations, those conversations were off because there's so much of that story that wasn't told and we don't know.
Right.
And I think too, one of the things about having a family member that's kind of like was in the industry, I sometimes think about, okay, what do you treat that artist that you're talking about just how you would treat your uncle if you was writing about him. And so that also indicates that sometimes you can be a little too close to the story.
Yeah.
But yeah, the process of just traveling, going to Nashville, eating that hot chicken.
Look. Now, having a hot chicken next to the Old Smoky distillery.
Yeah.
Look.
Yeah. So it was like the travel, hot chicken. Okay, I'm gonna go by all of these studios where Shirley Caesar recorded, even if they're closed now. Like it doesn't matter because I'm gonna get a sense of, so that summer I just took road trips.
Mm-hmm.
I left Charlottesville and I just drove. Then I think I parked in I just was driving. And then I flew somewhere. Like I got to Chicago, then Detroit. But it was just like, it's always, going to Shirley Caesar's church. Like, just seeing those dynamics. John P. Key. So that was the fun part. Just, kind of immersing myself in the culture, going to record stores, trying to find stores once you get the address,
mm-hmm.
and you find out that the Black-owned store is no longer at that spot, but it's been replaced by a hipster store. So also during this process, I've seen 3, maybe there were 6 Black-owned gospel shops in the country.
Wow.
I think now probably about 3 of them closed. And so it's like, but that was like fun. I just enjoyed the travel. I enjoyed the point of discovery. I enjoyed that rush that you get when you go into an archive and that archivist brings you that box that you
There it goes.
you bought it 3 days and you look at it and your heart starts pounding because it's even more in there than you thought was in there. So I had experience where they say, oh, yeah, baby, we got 2 files. And then you get there and it's like 2 boxes instead. So for me, like that was the fun part, immersing myself in the process of discovery. Like that was so, that was like an eating.
There it is.
On those trips, man. Thank God, So the spaces that I like, favorite places were definitely Detroit, Chicago, Nashville, and Oakland. So like when I went to Oakland, and by that point Edwin Hawkins had passed. So like they rent Walter Hawkins. I think they rent that church out. So it's also dealing with the empty space, the things that don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
but I went to Paramount where, that gospel movie was made, and the iconic Clark sisters performance of Is My Living in Vain. And just seeing that space was just like really powerful and meaningful for me. And yeah, just and I think like one time when I was in Oakland, actually I made a film. One of my students was there, and she did a film on Reed's Records, and so it's funny that film is now played at various film festivals. She did a really good job, but I was actually screening another film when when I was just doing the research,
Wow.
and so yeah, it was cool.
Outstanding. And so, with one of your students, that's actually a great way to pivot to one of our final questions here on this marathon run of an interview that we
I
we
know.
just we just
It's
vibing.
cool.
We look, you cool, I'm
I
cool.
hope you got good editing software.
Look, no, this is gonna be good. So I mentioned earlier that you are a prolific scholar. But what our listeners should also learn from our interview is that you are also an incredibly dynamic and kind teacher. But Adam, how would you know that if you've never stepped foot a day of your life in Charlottesville, Virginia? Well, shout out to the homies Allison Mitchell, Kiera Price, and Malcolm Cameron, because I know y'all listening. And thank y'all for talking up Dr. Harold here on today. So, how are the musical artists and big concepts slash themes in When Sunday Comes reflected in your classroom teaching at UVA and the broader publics that you write for, including my mother?
uh, Teaching is the most important thing that I do, and I would have never survived in academia without teaching and without that connection with students. I've in my 17 years at the University of Virginia, I've taught a variety of courses from Intro to African American and African Studies to a course I teach called Black Fire on the history of African Americans at UVA, and a course from Motown to hip hop, which I started teaching in 2010. And that course was supposed to have 30 students. And it ended up with, I think I ended up letting like 70 in.
Damn.
And then I taught a variation of the course in 2013 called The Sounds of Blackness. And it had 144 students, and like 141 were African American.
Wow.
Or Black, I should say. And so music is very much a part of my teaching, and it is in all of my classes. So, for example, in my intro to African American Studies, we spent almost 3 weeks on Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. And I teach it as a foundational text in Black Studies. And so the first what does it mean to be a problem? And we think about that in terms of Africana philosophy. We talk about the meaning of progress. That's a section in sociology. And then we have a section where we talk about Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and that debate, but also thinking about political science. So I may have them read some Adolph Reed or, Oliver Cox's stuff on Booker T. Washington. But then we focus on, of the sorrow songs.
Yep.
And we think about that as a foundational text in terms of Black music criticism, ethnomusicology. So they read that along with probably something from like Greg Tate or Daphne Brooks. Always Amiri Baraka's Blues People, usually the introduction to that. And thinking about music. So music is intertwined in all of this, but my Motown and hip hop class explores the evolution of African American, popular music from the 60s to the present. And I try to use music to get students to think about Black studies as a discipline, as an intellectual project, And so yeah, music is all of these things are sort of integrated into my teaching. It's always important for me that students leave with an understanding of Black studies as a discipline, its history, but also just to make sure that I always demonstrate and illustrate and illuminate the fullness of African humanity.
Mm.
And to get them to understand that Black studies, or to understand the distinction between Black studies and the study of Black people.
Mm.
And music is a way to get them to think about these things, to think about intertextuality, to think about how generations are always talking to each other and with each other. To think about the sampling that always goes on in Black intellectual life. And these classes have been just a space too where we build community, where we laugh, where they try to make me listen to stuff I don't want to listen to, where they see me get excited about people like Earl Simmons that they don't ever think I would get excited about.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just, these classes just became hugely popular. But I'm committed to teaching. I'm committed to helping students move into various aspects of. I'm into helping students kind of discover their voice or develop their voice. From 2012 to 2019, I was over the Distinguished Majors program in AES in Black Studies, and so I was really interested in finding students who wanted to go to grad school and wanted to, have a career in academia. So it's kind of interesting. The first class that I had, or DMP group, in 2012, one of them just finished from UPenn last year, and so you're always really nervous about you want them to get jobs. And her way of telling me that she had gotten a job was like she emailed me and she was like, "Yo, what's up, colleague?" She got a job at UVA in the School of Education,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah. But I'm just really I'm committed to teaching. I'm really committed to undergraduate training too. I need that. I mean, I like my graduate students. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, I teach these really pretty big courses at UVA, and so it's always about teaching, but connecting the students to other people and really building community. So I think that shows in my work too. I'm always trying to. Community is important to me. To write about it, but to also create it in a process of art making.
Mm-hmm.
In the process of making things to like create community. And so the idea is like that these students will build community in the classroom. So it doesn't surprise me like when I see, without me even saying anything, my former student, JT Wrong helping another student. Like they all
Like
know
me.
each other. So the student that I just told you about who got this job, who's going to be an assistant professor at UVA, her first year, Adam Getachew was her like peer advisor.
Wow.
So like Adam is a former student of mine. So
For real?
yeah,
Golly,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So I mean, like Adam and Adam and JT. So Adam graduated a year after JT.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Adam has always been like a boss. I remember one time I couldn't find my Black Reconstruction
Mm-hmm.
copy of Black Reconstruction. I remember like walking over because I don't know, was I not texting or something? I should have been like in 2008, but I don't know. Maybe I lost my phone. And she lives on the lawn and
Mm-hmm.
knocking on the door and saying, "Can I borrow you?" So Adam was always like on another level, but like to think about that, like that genealogy. And so, Adam and Wintry. And so, like, when Wintry told me she got the job here, Adam was the first person I texted.
Mm-hmm.
But so that's extremely, important for me And it's important, like people like Kiara, that they know about people like Adolf. And it's to understand that like your job is to create community. So that's even like when we're doing the films and stuff. Like it's about art making, but it's also about community. And so for me, like teaching, yeah, it's the classroom, and that's extremely important. Like at the end of the day, that's every Tuesday and Thursday for an hour and a half or hour and 15 minutes, you have a chance to shape how people view the world. And you have an opportunity to have people shape how you view the world. So like teaching is, I don't compromise with that. That's not optional. That's the number one priority. And so, yeah, you just constantly creating community. So in some ways, I think, and it gives me such pleasure and joy. So I think even like when I think about the films that I've done with Kevin, a lot of it is about whether it's on the history of Black studies, whether it's on the story of Sly Stone coming to UVA in '73. It's a lot about is kind of recreating that effective dimension of my experience. Yeah.
Goodness gracious. See, y'all, I told y'all. Y'all know whenever we get someone in the seat for New Books in African American Studies with me and everyone else on the channel, they're gonna bring that black fire because she's at UVA. So we already know Dr. Harold, and Dr. Harold is from Duval. She's from Duval County too. Jacksonville, if you know. You know what I'm saying? So Dr. Harold, this is our final question, and so we're gonna get it out on the fun one. So, we're gonna return to the process a little bit. So, I love asking my favorite historians and writers about their own workspace. So, if you had all the money in the world, money wasn't a thing, and you needed to build your own writing, reading, and thinking space, what would it look like? What would it smell like? What art would you get? And what is playing in the background? Paint the picture for the people, Professor.
It would be a lot of wood, two-story, books everywhere, earthy colors, multiple offices for other artists and writers to be in that space, studio space. Miles Davis, Nefertiti is probably playing. You can get some coffee, though I don't like coffee.
Okay.
It kind of looks like Adele's place, I think, from Moesha. I've always wanted like a book. You know what? It would be like, I'm sorry, this is not poetic right now, but it would be like Sankofa in DC.
Ooh, yes.
So it would be bookstore, art space, so a lab where people want to show a film or play their music. Because in my mind, everything that I'm involved in eventually will come together. So yeah, that's what it would look like. It would it would be like an open art space. Some of that modernistic furniture. I like that kind of stuff. Maybe every other Saturday, you could we screen a film. You can listen to some poetry. So it would be a space open for artist talks. Yeah, it's like, so I guess it's like Sankofa meets the Astor Gate spot meets Moesha.
Look, no, that's lovely.
With Coco and SWV singing in the background. I'm like kind of obsessed with that right now.
There
I'll
it
get over
is.
that.
Well, hey, Dr. Harold, y'all, this has been an amazing experience to talk with someone who I consider kindred because we both Florida people. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just lovely and amazing that, y'all, we've had the amazing opportunity to chat with Dr. Claudrena and Harold, author of When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras. And this amazing book was published by our friends at the University of Illinois Press. And so, please, y'all, go get this book. Please go get it today and whenever y'all listen to this interview. And if y'all like this podcast episode, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And so, this is your host, Adam McNeil of New Books in African American Studies. I believe this is episode number 86. And so, no matter the number, we got it done. And I hope that y'all enjoy it because this has been a labor of love. And Dr. Harold, it has been an amazing opportunity to chat with you, not only today, but as we say in the church, on today. Because as we saw today, it is interview time in the sanctuary. And so, y'all, until next time, New Books in African American Studies, Adam McNeil, over and out.